In the pantheon of pre-war German cars, the Mercedes-Benz 130 proved to be an obscure advancement in the technological and stylistic capabilities of the carmaker during a troubled time in the nation's history. But in its desire to push the boundaries of the prevailing manufacturing and design, the resulting machine was a somewhat awkward and difficult car, notorious for its odd looks and unforgiving handling, thus making it an often forgotten part of the Mercedes-Benz lineup. The Mercedes-Benz 130 did not begin as a single model idea, so much as a response to a cluster of pressures and enthusiasms that built up during the 1920s, when the motor industry was being tugged in several directions at once, with Daimler and Benz having merged in 1926 to form Daimler-Benz AG, a firm that inherited not only a proud engineering culture, but also an awkward commercial reality. The firm's reputation rested on expensive, technically sophisticated cars, yet the European market after the First World War was becoming increasingly price-sensitive, and Germany in particular was shaped by taxation, fuel costs, and a public that wanted modern motoring without the running costs, thirsts, and social signalling of a large six-cylinder saloon, and by the late Weimar years had become marked by economic uncertainty and shifting patterns of consumption. Mercedes-Benz could see that there was money to be made at the top end, and it remained strong there, but it could not ignore the fact that small cars and the promise of broader ownership were becoming the direction of travel across the industry, and even for prestige manufacturers, the question was no longer whether the lower and middle segments mattered, but how to enter them without diluting identity. At the same time, the 1920s were an era of experimentation in what a car ought to look like and how it ought to be arranged, as the old assumptions had started to feel less like natural laws and more like habits, with the conventional layout of an engine up front and a propeller shaft running under the floor to a driven rear axle having become dominant because it was straightforward, mechanically intelligible, and easy to service with the tools and skills available almost everywhere. Yet this imposed compromises that became more glaring as customers expected more comfort and better performance from smaller engines, demanding a long bonnet even when there was little need for such length, as well as swallowing cabin space that could otherwise be given to passengers, and it created a transmission tunnel and driveline that complicated the floor, raised the seating position, and made bodies harder to package cleanly. One of the most important provocations came from aerodynamics, as although streamlining is often associated with the 1930s, the intellectual groundwork was laid earlier, when engineers started borrowing ideas from aircraft, studying airflow, and taking wind tunnel research seriously enough to let it affect the whole silhouette of a vehicle, rather than just its details, with the German designer, Edmund Rumpler, being pivotal here because he treated air resistance not as an abstract scientific curiosity, but as a design problem with practical consequences. His Tropfenwagen, or teardrop car of the early 1920s, approached the car as an object moving through a fluid, and therefore something whose shape mattered to speed, stability, and economy. And while the Tropfenwagen was never a mainstream commercial success and remained too unusual for most buyers, it circulated as a powerful example of what could be achieved if one stopped treating the body as a carriage-like shell placed over mechanical parts. It implied that the body should be a coherent form, and that the mechanical layout ought to serve that form rather than fight it, with its teardrop profile suggesting a different relationship between body and architecture, and if the nose could be shortened, if the frontal area could be reduced, and if the body could taper cleanly at the rear, the car might be quieter, faster for a given power output, and potentially more economical. Parallel to this aerodynamic thinking was a structural and packaging argument that appealed to engineers even when the styling arguments sounded speculative, with rear-mounted engines promising a shorter front end and the possibility of a flatter, more spacious passenger compartment, as there was no longer a large engine occupying the forward third of the car, while putting the engine at the back also removed the need for a long prop shaft, which in turn suggested a simpler floor structure and fewer rotating parts running the length of the vehicle, potentially reducing vibration and mechanical loss. In principle, a rear-engine car could be lighter and mechanically cleaner, and it could also look more modern because it did not need the tall, upright radiator and bonnet line that had become a visual signature of traditional cars, Mercedes included, with the latter mattering significantly, as Mercedes-Benz's established image was tied to a particular front-end presence, a sort of formal face anchored by the radiator, and a rear-engine layout threatened to erase that familiar cue. These ideas were not confined to one firm, and Daimler-Benz was not working in isolation, with Central Europe especially seeing a small but influential set of engineers pushing the rear-engine concept with real conviction, often coupling it with independent suspension and backbone-type chassis structures that could be both stiff and compact, with Hans Ledwinker at Tatra, for example, developing chassis and suspension approaches that suited rear-engine cars, including backbone frames that could provide rigidity, while leaving the center of the car relatively uncluttered and well-suited to routing controls and pipes. This was part of a broader movement away from rigid axles and towards independent suspension, which promised better comfort and road holding on the mixed road surfaces of the period, where cobbles, patched tarmac, and unpaved stretches could appear within the same journey, with the rear-engine layout having theoretical benefits in traction too, as by placing weight over the driven wheels, this could help a small car pull away cleanly on poor surfaces. Inside Daimler-Benz, the man who turned these currents into a concrete program was Hans Niebel, the company's chief engineer, and by 1930 he had been tasked with exploring a small rear-engine Mercedes that could embody these modern principles, with this decision being not simply a technical whim, nor merely an indulgence in fashionable streamlining, but instead a strategic hedge grounded in the sense that the next decade might reward compactness and efficiency as much as it rewarded power and prestige. The first tangible result was a prototype developed with chassis specialist Max Wagner and completed in 1931, generally referred to as the W17 or 120H, which was, in essence, a testbed for the concept rather than a finished product, and comprised a compact two-door body with 4 seats, a power unit placed behind the passenger compartment, and a chassis arrangement aimed at keeping the structure light while allowing independent wheel movement. Early work centered on a rear-mounted air-cooled 4-cylinder boxer engine of around 1.2 litres, producing roughly 25 horsepower, chosen for its short length and its suitability for the flat packaging a rear installation encourages, and by 1932 and 1933, the program had broadened into more adventurous prototypes, some of which pushed streamlining further than the first W17 bodies. A particularly revealing dead end was the D experiment, in which a 3-cylinder diesel engine, the OM134, was tried, producing around 30 horsepower, and while the idea was bold, the noise and harshness were too pronounced, and the vehicle was rejected after a dozen test cars were assembled from these developmental strands, enough to provide real-world feedback across seasons and road types, but not so many that Daimler-Benz was committed to a production path before it was ready. Out of this experimental phase, the production-intended car began to crystallize as the Mercedes-Benz 130, internally associated with the W23 designation, with the engine selected being a rear-mounted 4-cylinder of 1,308 cc with a modest output in the mid-20s horsepower range, reflecting a pragmatic balance between performance, durability, and thermal management. Chassis and suspension were the areas where the 130 most clearly expressed the lessons of 1931 to 33, with the backbone structure providing the central stiffness, while independent suspension was employed at all 4 corners, an advanced specification for a small car of the time, and a clear statement that comfort mattered, while up front, transverse leaf springs were used, a solution that could be compact and robust, while at the rear a swing axle arrangement with coil springs supported the mass of the engine and transaxle. When the Mercedes-Benz 130 was shown in February 1934 at the Berlin Motor Show, it arrived as something of a statement about direction as well as range, though in practice, the 130's story between 1934 and 1936 became a lesson in how uncompromising physics can be, and when development time is limited by the realities of production and sales. With so much of the car's mass sitting behind the rear axle, the 130 was inherently tail-heavy, and no amount of wishful thinking could change the basic weight distribution, with the rear bias affecting not just ultimate grip, but the way the car behaved as its balance shifted mid-corner, and it could feel lively, even nervous, especially if the driver lifted off the throttle or asked the car to change direction abruptly. Where a front-engine saloon tended to give early warning through safe understeer, the 130 could feel as if it wanted to tighten its line unexpectedly, or let the rear begin to lead the front. And to motorists raised on conventional cars, where the nose carried the bulk of the weight and the steering wheel was anchored by a loaded front axle, the 130's responses could seem unfamiliar and for some unsettling. This is not to say the 130 was universally criticized, and it could be driven adequately on the German roads of the time, and those roads themselves mattered, with smoother surfaces and different traffic speeds that could flatter a car that might feel less compromised on rougher, narrower routes, with contemporaries often admiring its comfort, and in that respect the engineering ambition was not misplaced. However, adequate was not enough for a Mercedes-Benz buyer, and that was the commercial problem Daimler-Benz could not talk its way around, with sales never matching Daimler-Benz's hopes, and that commercial reality dictated the next steps. As though the company did not abandon the rear engine idea immediately, it did attempt to reframe the proposition, with the Mercedes-Benz 150 or W30 following as a more focused, more powerful interpretation, and in so doing it quietly acknowledged a key point that if the rear engine layout was hard to sell as a conventional small saloon, it might make more sense in a car that advertised itself as specialized and sporting. The 150 used the 130's underlying thinking, but pursued performance rather than everyday family motoring, with a larger and stronger four-cylinder engine and a two-seat body in its best-known form, with period competition and rally appearances suggesting that, with careful development, a rear-engine Mercedes could handle much more convincingly than the 130 had, and in these environments, the company could point to tangible results rather than brochure promises. By 1936, the 130 itself was discontinued, and the decision had a very Mercedes-Benz logic to it, but Daimler-Benz nevertheless persisted with the basic architecture through the Mercedes-Benz 170h or W28, introduced in 1936 alongside the more conventional 170V, and in many ways the 170h was the company's second attempt to make the rear-engine Mercedes feel like a complete, rounded product rather than an intriguing technical experiment. It used a larger engine and a more mature presentation, and it handled better than the 130, suggesting that lessons were being learned and applied, and in effect, the 170h confirmed the commercial verdict already implied by the 130, that the rear-engine Mercedes was an engineer's solution looking for a sufficiently large group of buyers who wanted that solution, though the mainstream market for Mercedes-Benz in the 1930s tended to value a particular blend of prestige, practicality, and assured behavior, and the rear-engine model struggled to hit that blend consistently. From 1936 to 1939, the rear-engine line survived as a niche within Daimler-Benz rather than a strategic pivot, and the company built the 170h in limited numbers until production ended in 1939, when political and industrial pressures made low-demand variants hard to justify, and the direction of German industry was shifting decisively towards war production, and by the end of the decade, the rear-engine Mercedes experiment had produced 3 related production cars and a handful of prototypes. Today, the rear-engine Mercedes-Benz experiments hold a complex legacy, presenting a mixture of ambition amidst a rapidly evolving technological scene and market, but also demonstrating the limitations of said technology in creating a car that was easily accessible in terms of driving experience to buyers unaccustomed to a rear-engine machine. And it was this, combined with the reputation of Mercedes for luxurious motoring, that rendered cars like the 130, 150, and 170h a niche oddity in Germany's pre-war motoring scene.